I was handed my mother's lawsuit at my father's memorial lunch, in front of 30 relatives, the pastor, and my 15-year-old daughter. The process server said my full name clearly enough that every conversation in the private dining room died at once. My mother did not flinch. She sat at the head of the table in black silk, one hand resting beside my father's framed photograph, as if grief and strategy belonged in the same posture. My brother Grant kept his eyes on the table. My daughter Tessa stopped so suddenly that the bread plate in her hand tilted and nearly slipped. I looked down at the envelope. Petition for recovery of misappropriated funds. Filed by Evelyn Mercer. Against me. For $360,000. No one asked the man to leave. No one said there had to be some mistake. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the air vent and the soft clink of someone setting down a fork too carefully. I opened the complaint, skimmed the first page, then looked at my mother. You had me served at Dad's memorial? She gave me a tired, wounded look meant for the room. Not for me. I waited as long as I could, Lena. That was when I knew this had been staged. Not just filed. Staged. The timing, the witnesses, the silence afterward. She wanted the accusation to arrive before anyone sat down to eat, before sympathy could form anywhere except around her. Grant leaned forward with the solemn expression he used when he wanted to look responsible. Mom didn't want a scene. The room stayed still. Behind him, the memorial board was filled with photographs from our family's life vacations, birthdays, my father holding me on his shoulders at the county fair, Grant grinning beside him on a fishing dock, all of it framed in white lilies like a public record of belonging. And now, in front of that history, my mother was replacing me with a different role entirely. Not daughter, not caregiver, not the one who had handled appointments and bills after my father's stroke, but thief. Aunt Celeste was the first to break. Lena, is it true? No, I said. Just that. Nothing else. My mother reached into her handbag and slid a second packet toward my cousin instead of toward me. Bank summaries, she said softly. Grant helped me gather them after we realized what was missing. Grant finally looked up, and even then he did not look at me. We tried to handle it privately. That was a lie. No one had called me. No one had asked a question. They had gone straight to humiliation. I turned another page. The dates of the transfers were listed neatly. One of them matched the week my father was in rehab. Another matched the Friday my mother had told me she needed funds for a private nurse. The structure was polished enough to frighten people who did not understand financial paperwork. But one detail caught immediately in my mind. The receiving account was partially listed, but the beneficiary line was missing. Omitted. Not unavailable. Omitted. I looked at my mother again. When did you file this? Yesterday, she said. The court stamp said 3 days earlier. Grant cut in too fast. Does it matter? Yes, I said. That single word shifted the room slightly. Not toward me. Not yet. But away from them. Then my mother lowered her voice and delivered the line she had probably saved for maximum damage. If you admit what you did and step away from anything financial, I won't have to take this further. A few people glanced toward Tessa. That was the moment the story stopped being about money. My daughter moved closer to me without speaking. I felt her hand touch my wrist under the table. Small and cold and tense. They were not just accusing me of theft. They were building a version of me that could follow her into school, into family holidays, into every room where my father's name still meant something. So I folded the complaint, slipped it into my bag, and stood. Thank you for letting me know, I said. My mother blinked. Grant straightened, already preparing for a louder exit than the one I gave them. I bent and kissed Tessa's temple. Eat something. I'll call you soon. Then I looked at my mother, then at my brother. I'm not discussing this in front of my father's picture, I said. But I will answer it. Grant finally found his voice. You don't get to walk out after this. I met his eyes for the first time. Actually, I said. I think I do. I walked out while no one at the table moved to stop me. In the hallway, I pulled the complaint back out and read the transfer page again, slower this time. The dates were familiar. The amount was deliberate. The filing had been prepared before my mother hugged me in her kitchen 2 days earlier and asked whether I could bring over soup because the house felt too quiet without my father. By the time I reached the elevator, I knew two things. My mother had not built this alone, and somewhere inside the paper trail, they had hidden a detail they did not realize I would recognize. By the time I reached my car, the humiliation had already done what my mother wanted it to do. It had entered the family before facts could. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine and read the complaint again, slower this time. The first pass had told me what the accusation was. The second told me how it had been built. It was arranged for emotional impact, not legal strength. Bold allegations, selected summaries, partial account references, no full monthly statements, no signed transfer authorizations, no complete beneficiary trail. Enough paper to frighten relatives. Not enough to answer a judge for long. The dates were the most dangerous part because they were real. One matched the week my father was discharged from rehab. Another matched the Friday my mother called me crying about the overnight nurse quitting. Real dates make false stories feel honest. People hear something familiar and assume the rest belongs with it. I called my attorney from the parking lot before I called anyone else. Her name was Corinne Vale. She had handled my divorce 2 years earlier and understood the difference between a legal dispute and a staged attack disguised as one. "Corinne," I said when she answered. "I was just served at my father's memorial." A pause. "By who?" "My mother." Her voice changed immediately. Sharper. Cleaner. "Tell me the claims." Misappropriation. Elder financial abuse. 360,000. Emergency restrictions on financial involvement. Good. Now listen carefully. Do not call your mother. Do not call your brother. Scan everything and send it to me right now. Read me the filing date. I did. The notary date? I read that too. She was quiet for a beat. That complaint was prepared before today. Read me the exhibits. I read them one by one. When I got to the transfer summary and the omitted beneficiary information, she cut in. "Stop there. Did they attach full statements?" "No." "Any dual authorization records? Any trust instructions? Any signed directives from you?" "No." Her tone flattened in a way I had learned to trust. "Then they're relying on the accusation itself to do the work." I looked through the windshield at the restaurant entrance, where two relatives had just stepped outside and were pretending not to search for my car. They wanted the room before they wanted the court. "I think that's exactly right," Corinne said. "Go home. Send me everything. Then pull every estate and trust record your father ever put in your hands. If this was staged, there will be a weak seam somewhere." I ended the call and drove home. The house was empty for another half-hour before Tessa would get back. And the silence helped. Not emotionally, structurally. I went straight to the hall closet, pulled down the gray fireproof case my father had made me keep after his second hospitalization, and set it on the dining table. He had given it to me on a rainy Tuesday 18 months earlier, when his right hand was shaking badly enough that he was annoyed by his own signature. "You listened the first time?" he had said while sliding the case across the table. "That saves me from repeating myself." Inside were copies of everything he never trusted one location to hold. Trust summaries, property schedules, insurance records, advisor contacts, banking notes in his blocky handwriting. At the bottom sat a sealed envelope with my name on it and, beneath that, the amended trust packet from the year his health began slipping faster. I went to the amendment first. Primary trustee during my father's lifetime. My father. Successor authority after incapacity or death. My mother and a corporate co-trustee. Not me. That mattered immediately. If my mother was telling people I had diverted trust-related funds, but the trust itself required dual authority for major movement after my father's incapacity, then either the money had not come from the structure she was implying, or someone had moved it another way and hoped no one in the family understood the difference. I turned to the administrative restrictions and found what I was looking for. No transfer over $50,000 from the family holding account to a non-scheduled recipient could be completed without dual authorization after the amendment date. Wow. My mother could not lawfully move that amount alone. Neither could I. That changed the shape of the accusation. It was no longer just cruel. It was technically unstable. I opened the sealed envelope next. Inside was one short note and a business card. Lena, if there is confusion later, do not argue from memory. Call Daniel Sayer. He has the administrative ledger copies and the lockbox inventory. If your mother is well, this stays simple. If she is not, keep everything in writing. Dad, I read it once. Then again. Not because it was sentimental, because it was exact. Daniel Sayer was the outside fiduciary consultant my father had used during the trust amendment. Older, precise, impossible to charm. The kind of man who noticed what people assumed was too small to matter. I called the number on the card. After a short transfer, he came on the line himself. Miss Mercer, I'm sorry about your father. Thank you. I need a direct answer. After the amendment, could my mother move $360,000 from the family holding account without co-authorization? No. No hesitation. No softening. Could it be done through a pre-existing template? Not lawfully. Not under the post-amendment controls. I sat down. Then if there are transfer summaries, I would want the source account, the authorization trail, and the beneficiary records, he said. Summaries are not enough. They served summaries. Of course they did. There was no surprise in his voice, which told me more than alarm would have. One more question, I said. Were any receiving accounts ever added for my brother? Paper moved on his end. A keyboard clicked once or twice. Not as a scheduled trust recipient, but your mother added 2 outside accounts to her personal banking profile last year. Whose? One is in your brother's name. The other belongs to a limited liability company. What company? Red Cedar Home Services, LLC. The name hit me a second late. Grant had mentioned Red Cedar around Christmas, dismissing it as a side venture when my father asked about it. I remembered my father's face, then not confused. Just watchful. Can you send me anything? I asked. Not without counsel involved. But if your attorney contacts me, I can confirm the administrative control structure and the records we hold. That's enough for now. It should be, he said. Then, after a pause, if the filing was timed publicly, the financial allegation may only be part of the objective. I understood what he meant less than 10 minutes later. My phone lit up with 3 messages almost back to back. The first was from my cousin Delia. Your mom is telling people she tried to protect you privately for months. The second was from my Aunt Celeste. Please tell me this isn't true. I defended you. The third came from a number I recognized only after reading the signature line. Harold Pike, First Covenant School Board. Lena, in light of what I heard today, we may need to delay your appointment to the Parent Advisory Council until matters are clarified. I stared at that message longer than the others. That role mattered because it was tied to Tessa's school, her stability, and the ordinary credibility I had rebuilt after my divorce. My mother knew that. She knew exactly how fast a financial accusation could move through a church school circle, and how easily investigation could become unstable, then unfit, then keep some distance. The lawsuit was not just about money. It was about formalizing a version of me in as many rooms as possible before I had time to answer it. I forwarded the school board message to Corinne. Her reply came almost immediately. Do not respond. I'm sending notice of representation today. Send me Daniel Sayer's number now. I did. A little after 4, Tessa came home. She set her backpack by the stairs, saw the papers spread across the dining table, and stopped. Her face was composed in that careful teenage way that always worried me more than tears. Did Grandma call? I asked. She nodded and handed me her phone. Sweetheart, adults are dealing with upsetting financial issues. I know your mother can be a lot when she feels cornered. If you want to stay somewhere calm tonight, your room is ready here. I handed the phone back. Tessa looked at me steadily. That wasn't about a room. No, because my mother had no room ready for her in any real sense. Tessa had barely stayed there in a year. This was not comfort. It was Tessa. Hit was positioning. Gentle grandmother. Volatile mother. Child offered refuge. Did you do any of it? She asked. No. She nodded once, as if the question had been necessary, but the answer had not been in doubt. Then she opened the refrigerator, took out the leftover pasta, and asked, "Do you want some too?" It was such a small, practical question that it made the whole day feel heavier instead of lighter. "Yes," I said. "Please." While she heated the food, I stacked the papers in cleaner order and began a timeline on my laptop. Date, request, account, purpose, witness, supporting record, rehab discharge payment, nursing deposit, bathroom rail installation, insurance bridge, prescription correction, care leaves a pattern, theft hides one. At 6:11, Grant emailed me. Subject: You need to settle this quietly. The message was only 3 lines. You've embarrassed Mom enough. If you sign the acknowledgement and step away from any claim on Dad's remaining assets, she may agree not to involve the school. Think about Tessa before you make this uglier. I forwarded it to Corrine without replying. She called less than a minute later. Well, she said, there's your first written sign it was planned. I looked toward the kitchen, where Tessa was rinsing her bowl at the sink. Shoulders held a little too straight for 15. In the restaurant, my mother had tried to turn me into the accusation before I could speak. Now, sitting in my own house with my father's note open beside me and my brother's email on my screen, I could finally see the first seam in what they had built. They were not confused. They were in a hurry. The first hard proof did not come from a dramatic confession or a leaked statement. It came from something much more useful: a missing attachment. The next morning, Corrine sent my mother's attorney a formal preservation notice. By breakfast, counsel had replied with the usual careful language about protecting records and avoiding interference. On its face, the email was routine. What mattered was the attachment list. I read it twice. Their response referenced supporting materials that had not been included in the complaint served on me at my father's memorial. Internal message summaries, caregiver payment notes, and one item labeled beneficiary update confirmation. That phrase changed everything. Because if there was a beneficiary update confirmation, then the receiving accounts in the transfer trail had not appeared by accident. Someone had deliberately added them first, which meant the root existed before the accusation did. I called Corrine immediately. You saw it, she said. Yes. They referenced a beneficiary update confirmation they never served. Exactly, she said. They wanted the family to hear theft before anyone saw setup. That was the first clean edge of proof. Not instinct. Not tone. Structure. They had built a selective file. I went back through my old emails at the dining table, searching the months before my father died with a different eye than I had ever used before. Not nurse. Not grief. Not care. Process. Updates. Confirmation. The small administrative messages people ignore because they do not look like danger when they arrive. At 9:02, I found the first one. A short email from my mother, sent 7 months earlier with no subject line. Can you call me before noon? Need help moving things around. Grant is here, but he never understands the bank screens. At the time, it had barely registered. Now it mattered for one reason. Grant had been physically present during at least one account. Management session long before anyone claimed money had mysteriously gone missing. I flagged it and kept going. 9 minutes later, I found the second email. It was a routine bank notification my mother had been copied on, and, at the time, had forwarded around carelessly enough that I never thought to save it separately. It was not a transfer notice. It was a profile maintenance confirmation. External recipient information updated successfully. No beneficiary name in the body. No destination visible. Just a date, a timestamp, and the kind of bland wording financial systems use when they are recording something important without explaining it to anyone casually glancing at their phone. The timestamp matched the same week as one of the transfers listed in the complaint. I forwarded both emails to Corrine. Her response came back almost at once. Good. Keep pulling. They may have hidden the route in ordinary admin traffic. At 9:47, Daniel Sayer called. He had already spoken to Corrine, which meant he was choosing his words carefully, but carefully was enough. There was an internal concern raised last year, he said, regarding a request from your mother to add outside recipient profiles more quickly than policy allowed. I did not interrupt. The request was not processed through trust administration, he continued. It was redirected to her personal banking relationship team. That distinction mattered immediately. So the money trail in the complaint may not reflect trust-controlled movement at all. That is my concern, he said. And if they are presenting personal account routing changes as though you diverted funds through a trust structure, that would be materially misleading. I let that sit for 1 second before asking the question that mattered most. Was Grant involved? Paper moved on his end. Then a keyboard. There is a service log note, he said. During one call, your brother answered 2 verification questions on speakerphone before your mother corrected him. That was the first hard proof. Not because it solved the whole case, but because it destroyed the central fiction. My mother and Grant had presented this as a daughter's secret financial abuse discovered after the fact. The service note placed him inside the account access process while recipient routes were being built. He was not reacting to the transfers. He was there when they were shaping the path. After the call, I stood at the kitchen counter for a moment and looked out over the backyard. The sprinkler clicked across the grass. A delivery van passed the house. Nothing explosive happened, but the stillness made the truth easier to name. They had not found a hole and decided I belonged inside it. They had cut one and written my name over it later. By late morning, the bank's fraud risk unit responded to Kareen's preliminary inquiry just enough to help without giving away substance. They would not discuss details yet, but they confirmed in writing that the disputed activity involved external recipient profiles added or modified within the prior 12 months. Profiles. Plural. That mattered. One mistaken transfer can be argued. A prepared set of external recipient routes belongs to planning. Then my mother made her first mistake in her own voice. Just before noon, she left me a voicemail. Soft tone. Controlled breathing. The sound of a woman trying very hard to become the reasonable one on record. Lena, I don't understand why you're forcing this to become adversarial. If you would stop involving outsiders, we could still settle this as family. I'm trying very hard not to make anything public that would hurt you with Tessa's school or the church board. Please think carefully. I saved the audio and sent it to Kareen. She replied within a minute. Perfect. Don't answer. Because the threat was no longer implied. It was stated. Gently, yes. But clearly enough to preserve. At lunch, I drove Tessa's forgotten lunch bag to school. She met me outside the attendance office between classes, trying too hard to look unbothered. A girl in chemistry asked if I was leaving school, she said after taking the bag from me. I kept my voice even. What did you say? That she should focus on passing chemistry. Despite everything, that almost made me smile. Then she looked down at the paper bag in her hands. Grandma sent me a photo last night. What kind of photo? The guest room at her house. Fresh sheets. New lamp. Like she was proving I could stay there. So my mother had done it on 2 levels at once. The lawsuit above the table. Sanctuary staging beneath it. Gentle refuge for a child whose mother was being quietly recast as unstable. Send it to me, I said. She did. The room in the picture looked tidy in the way unused rooms do when they are prepared for evidence rather than comfort. Decorative pillow still stiff. Lamp cord visible. A single old framed photo on the dresser, carefully chosen to imply closeness without proving any current life. I forwarded that too. By mid-afternoon, Kareen had assembled the pieces into a clean theory. Lawsuit, school pressure, child positioning, family contamination, and now evidence that recipient routes were added before the supposed discovery of theft. But theory became proof an hour later. The bank sent a metadata acknowledgement in response to Kareen's preservation demand. Buried in it was a reference number tied to one of the external recipient modifications. Kareen matched it to the routine confirmation email I had found in my archive. Same date, same time window. And one more thing. The confirmation had not gone only to my mother. It had also been copied to Grant. I stared at that line for a long time. Not because it was emotional. Because it was clean. Grant had received notice of an external recipient update months before the memorial. Then he sat across from me in that private dining room and helped present the transfers as something discovered later, something shocking, something that required public shame and urgent legal action. He had known about the route while it was being built. I printed the email and placed it beside the complaint on the dining table. Then I built the stack in order. The complaint, the transfer summary, my mother's email placing Grant with her during account work, the bank's recipient update confirmation copied to Grant, my mother's voicemail threatening the school and church board. For the first time since the process server said my full name in front of my father's picture, the story had begun to hold on my side. Not because I had defended myself emotionally, because I could now prove they were not discovering anything. They were managing what had already been designed. Once the first hard proof was in place, the story stopped being emotional and became structural. That was where my mother began to lose control. By Thursday morning, Corrine had formal production requests out and a hearing date tentatively reserved for emergency relief. My mother's side had asked the court to freeze me out of any involvement with remaining family assets. Corrine answered by demanding the things they had carefully avoided showing in public. Source, account records, authorization trails, recipient, setup logs, profile, change history, banking communications, and every document tied to the disputed transfers. They had filed for impact. Now they were being forced into mechanics. At 9:30, Daniel Sayer's office sent Corrine a short administrative confirmation letter. It was not the full ledger, and it was not dramatic. But it did more damage than a dramatic document would have. It confirmed that after my father amended the trust, large external disbursements from the family holding structure required dual authorization, and that trust administration had not processed the external recipient additions connected to the period in dispute. In plain terms, the financial path my mother had implied at the memorial could not have happened through the structure she was invoking. Corrine called me as soon as she saw it. "This is the break," she said. "Your mother wrapped the accusation in trust language, because trust language sounds like legacy, duty, and protection. But the trust controls say no. So either the funds came from her personal side and she blurred the categories on purpose, or the complaint is so imprecise it misleads the court." I was standing in the pantry, pretending to finish a grocery list. Which is worse? For her? Depends what she knew when she signed. For Grant? Depends what he touched. That was the first time the whole framework felt visible to me. My mother had not simply accused me of stealing money. She had chosen the most emotionally powerful version of the money. By noon, the first partial bank production arrived under preservation compliance. It did not include full monthly statements yet, but it gave us header data, account categories, service logs, and profile change references. Corrine told me to read it exactly one way. "Not for outrage," she said. "For movement." So I did. The disputed transfers did not originate from trust administration. They did not originate from any login tied to me. They originated from my mother's personal household banking profile and moved through external recipient templates added during the same period Daniel had already flagged. The recipient details were partially redacted, but the tail numbers aligned with the outside profiles already linked to Grant and Red Cedar Home Services, LLC. There it was. Source. Route. Destination environment. The complaint said I had diverted family-controlled money intended for my mother's support. The records showed money leaving my mother's personal side and traveling into channels connected to my brother and his company. Then I was blamed for it. I sat at the dining table with the pages spread in front of me and felt something cooler than relief settle in. Precision. Because the real trick in my mother's complaint was not just accusation. It was category confusion. She had taken three things ordinary people hear as one: trust assets, household funds, and her personal banking, and spoken about them as if they were interchangeable. Say family money often enough, especially in a room full of grief. And most people stop asking which account actually moved. That ambiguity was doing almost all the work. Corrine called again a few minutes later. "You see it now?" "Yes." "Good. Then we name it correctly. Over and over. Source, authority, beneficiary. Separate each one, and her story starts collapsing. A second packet came in just after 1 o'clock. Service. Call notes and profile. Change metadata. One entry showed my mother requesting faster activation of outside recipient profiles. Another showed a banker documenting that an adult male on speakerphone attempted to answer verification questions and was reminded he was not the profile holder. Another reflected repeated urgency around large outbound movement and an escalation from ordinary support to relationship management. No one needed to write Grant's name into that log for it to matter. He had already been placed beside my mother during account work by her own email. The bank recipient update notice had already copied him. This log simply moved him from family witness to operational presence. He was not the son helping his mother recover missing money. He was part of the environment in which the roots were built. At 2:05, Corrine sent me a draft affidavit to review. It was dry, chronological, and exactly right. I had no personal login to my mother's banking. I had no ability to move trust-controlled funds alone. My caregiving tasks for my parents were documented administrative acts, not hidden financial control. The complaint served on me publicly omitted records that would have distinguished trust controls from personal account recipient setup. Post-service correspondence from my mother's own counsel referenced documents the public-facing filing had left out. There was nothing in it about betrayal, nothing about grief, nothing about being served in front of my father's photograph. Just structure. That made it stronger. In the middle of all that, I still had to pick Tessa up from orthodontics. She got into the car holding her retainer case and glanced at the folders on the passenger seat. Good day or bad day? Useful day. That sounds expensive. It usually is. She buckled in, then asked the question more directly than before. Did Grandma actually do it? I kept my eyes on the road. Your grandmother moved money through her side into routes connected to your uncle. Then they used paperwork to make it look like I had done something else. Tessa looked out the window for a moment. So she lied in adult. I almost smiled. Yes, that feels worse than regular lying. She was right. Polished dishonesty is more dangerous because adults confuse polish with truth. When we got home, she made toast and started her geometry at the kitchen island while I reviewed the next production batch. Nothing explosive happened in that hour. She asked where the cinnamon was. I asked whether she had turned in her history essay. The dryer buzzed. A package hit the porch. But the quiet felt different from the day before. Less like we were being hunted. More like something was being built carefully enough to hold. At 4:12, the first material tied to Red Cedar Home Services came in. Not a full company file yet. Just enough to identify the registered manager, mailing address, and formation date. Registered manager, Grant Hollis. Mailing address, a private mailbox 3 towns over. Formation date, 11 days after my father's second stroke. I read that line twice. Not because forming an LLC is suspicious by itself. It is not. But timing becomes evidence when money later starts using the channel. My father's health collapsed. And within days, my brother created a company with no visible operating history and no obvious business purpose that would justify receiving large family-linked inflows. The records were no longer just proving movement. They were proving sequence. And sequence is where intent starts showing. Corrine saw it the same way. The company date matters, she said. Not alone. But with the recipient updates, the source mismatch, and the memorial filing, it shows this was built step by step. By early evening, we had enough to do more than defend. Corrine filed a motion to compel expedited production and requested preservation of all profile change history. Outbound transfer authorizations, device logs, banker notes, and communications involving my mother, Grant, and Red Cedar. She also gave notice that if the court found material omission in the complaint's framing of the funds, we would seek sanctions. That word changed the air. A lawsuit can still pretend to be misunderstanding. Sanctions belong to conduct. At 6:03, my mother emailed me directly for the first time since the memorial. Lena, I'm being advised that you are escalating this in a way that will embarrass everyone. You know your father wanted family matters handled privately. Withdraw what your attorney is doing and we can discuss what is fair. I am still trying to protect you. No denial of the records. No explanation of the source account. Just privacy, fairness, and protection after she had served me in public and let the accusation travel through my daughter's school. I forwarded it to Corrine. Her reply came back immediately. Do not answer. What is fair is doing a lot of work there. She was right. People say fair when they know correct will not survive daylight. Later that evening, Tessa walked into the kitchen holding her phone. Grandma posted something. I dried my hands and took it. It was a photograph of my father in the garden with the caption, "Some losses are death. Others are the people you trusted most." No names. No facts. Just grief-shaped poison. Vague enough for her church circle to finish the sentence for her. How many comments? I asked. 32. Don't read them. I already did. Of course she had. That was the other half of the structure. Legal filing to formalize the story. Social messaging to contaminate it. Child positioning underneath. Family witnesses at the start. Pressure from every level before records could catch up. But by then the records were catching up. At 8:15, Corrine sent me the draft motion package with the exhibit index attached. Daniel Sayers' administrative confirmation. The trust provision requiring dual authorization. The service log showing outside recipient setup activity. The bank metadata identifying my mother's personal household profile as the transfer source. The recipient links tied to Grant and Red Cedar. My mother's voicemail invoking Tessa's school and the church board. Grant's email urging me to surrender any claim on my father's remaining assets. My mother's direct email asking me to withdraw legal action so we could discuss what is fair. I read the list once and set the laptop down. This was no longer a daughter asking not to be misunderstood. It was a structure of money, procedure, pressure, and concealment. My mother had tried to bury me inside three blurred ideas. Family money, family duty, family shame. The documents had done the opposite. They had separated everything cleanly. Source, authority, destination. And once those three things were no longer allowed to touch, her story could not keep its shape much longer. By Friday morning, the financial side of the case was finally strong enough to defend without guesswork. We could show where the money had actually come from, how the outside recipient routes had been added, how Grant had been present during account activity long before the memorial, and how carefully my mother had blurred personal banking, household support, and family legacy language into one accusation. That was enough to answer the complaint on paper. It still was not enough to explain the cruelty of it. Corrine called just after 9 and asked me one question that changed where I looked. What was happening in the house while they were building this? Until then, I had been reading like a woman under attack. After that, I started reading like the person who had been quietly keeping the family functional while the attack was being prepared. I opened the shared family calendar my father had insisted we use after his first hospitalization. It was still intact because no one had thought to remove me. Or maybe because they had needed me too much for too long to risk doing it too early. The entries were full of the kind of labor families rarely name unless it disappears. Rehab appointments, cardiology follow-ups, medication pickups, grocery delivery windows, home nursing shifts, imaging, therapy transport, overnight stays, and all the small practical errands that gather around illness until they become a second life. My name was everywhere across those months, not symbolically, functionally. Then I laid the financial timeline over it. Grant's company had been formed 11 days after my father's second stroke. The first outside recipient update happened during the same week. I was driving my father to speech therapy twice and reorganizing his medication binders because my mother said she could not keep track of anything anymore. One of the larger disputed transfers was made the day after I sat beside her in an oncology waiting room while she cried over a possible lesion that later turned out to be benign. Another came during the week Tessa had pneumonia, when my mother still called to ask whether I could come over, because my father settled more easily when I was there. I sat with those overlaps longer than I needed to. Once they were aligned, the moral shape of the betrayal changed. They had not built this after trust collapsed. They had built it while I was still carrying them, while I was still useful, while I was still exhausted enough not to imagine that the people depending on me were also arranging something around my absence. That was the line. Not just that they moved money. Not just that they blamed me. They used the season when I was most needed as cover. At 10:30, I found the first written piece that made that impossible to soften. It was not dramatic. It was not long. It was an email preview saved in an old archive because my mother had once mistyped my address into a draft before removing it from the final version. The line that mattered was simple. Can you come by after Lena leaves? I don't want to discuss any of this while she's still handling the binders. Handling the binders was me. Medication schedules, insurance folders, home health contacts, specialist notes, billing packets, passwords my father wanted written down but never left loose, all the systems that keep sickness from dissolving into confusion. I had spent months doing that work because someone had to. And while I was doing it, my mother was arranging separate conversations to begin after I was gone. I sent the message to Corrine. She replied a minute later. That proves intent to work around you while still using you. That was exactly right. It did not prove theft by itself. It proved design. I kept going. The next piece came from an old cloud backup tied to the iPad I had set up for my mother when her hands started hurting too much to write lists. Most of what synced there was harmless. Recipes, grocery reminders, pharmacy notes, bridge lunches. But one folder had uploaded before she later turned sharing off. It was labeled House, and inside was a short checklist written in the flat, practical tone people use for errands, not ethics. Call bank or reroute. Ask Daniel timeline. Move papers from study. Tessa room if needed. Church before school. I read it several times because the plainness of it made it worse. Banking first, paper placement second. My daughter after that. Reputation channels in order. Corrine had already described the strategy in legal terms. Here it was in my mother's own domestic shorthand, stripped of performance. Not panic, not confusion, not grief. Sequence. That was when anger finally reached me. But it came in a colder form than I would have expected. My mother had reduced Tessa's life to a tactical consideration. A room if needed. Church before school. Atmosphere before facts. She was not simply trying to win against me. She was arranging a substitute environment around my daughter before the public attack had even fully unfolded. I had to leave the house for a pharmacy pickup after that, and I was grateful for the interruption. In the parking lot, I saw a woman about my mother's age helping her husband out of a car, guiding him slowly by the elbow and pausing to straighten his sleeve before she closed the door. It was a tiny gesture, one that would have disappeared on any other day. Instead, it stayed with me all the way home because it reminded me what caregiving actually looks like when it is real. Repetitive. Practical. Mostly invisible. Built out of hundreds of acts no one ever applauds because they are too ordinary to perform for anyone. That was what I had been doing. And they had used that ordinariness as camouflage. When I got back, Corrine was waiting on a video call. I showed her the calendar overlay, the draft email preview, and the synced notes folder. She studied the checklist quietly, then said, "This is the part that matters." She did not need to explain it. The banking records proved movement and concealment. These materials proved mindset. They showed that while I was still functioning as caregiver, organizer, daughter, and stabilizer, my mother and Grant were already building channels that assumed my eventual removal. Then Corrine asked me when my mother had started insisting that more things stay verbal instead of written. After Dad's second stroke, I said, "More often after that." "That fits," she said. "They needed you useful, but not too clearly documented where it would matter later." I sat very still after that, because it explained more than I wanted it to. I had not been erased all at once. I had been managed carefully, kept where I was needed, omitted where proof might one day protect me. By mid-afternoon, another small piece made the pattern harder to deny. Months earlier, I had paid a catering invoice on my own card for my parents' anniversary dinner because my mother said cash flow was tight that week and she did not want your father embarrassed. She reimbursed me later, and until then I had remembered the event only as one more practical burden in a season full of them. But when I pulled the reimbursement thread for documentation, I found the surrounding emails. In one message to the venue manager, my mother had asked that Grant be listed as the primary family contact for immediate decisions. In another, sent privately to him, she wrote, "We should get used to making things cleaner going forward. Lena takes everything personally." Cleaner. That was the word that stayed with me. Not easier. Not simpler. Cleaner, meaning with less witness, less friction, less me. That was when all the smaller substitutions finally lined up. Grant on the banker call. Grant as primary contact. Grant's company as the receiving route. A room staged for Tessa. School and church pressure prepared in parallel. Me still carrying meals, paperwork, appointments, pharmacy pickups, and household systems while they quietly rearranged the exits around me. They were not improvising my removal. They were practicing it. Tessa came home a little after 4 and found me still at the dining table with the records spread wider than usual. She looked at the pages, then at me. "Bad day?" she asked. "Clear day." She nodded, opened the refrigerator, washed the strawberries, and set half in a bowl beside me without asking whether I wanted them. It was such a small act of care that it almost hurt more than the documents had. Then she leaned against the counter and asked what I had found. I told her the truth as simply as I could. This didn't start when they filed. It started while I was still helping. She stood there for a moment, taking that in. Then she said, "I think the pretending is the worst part." She was right. Children understand betrayal faster than adults do, because they notice how long someone lets love keep doing useful work while the betrayal is already moving underneath it. That evening we made a normal dinner because normal dinners matter when a house is under pressure. I reheated tomato soup, made grilled cheese, and listened to Tessa ask whether her geometry quiz was Monday or Tuesday while the dishwasher ran in the background. Nothing dramatic happened. No new document arrived. No one called. But the ordinary rhythm of the meal made the emotional meaning of the money settle more fully than it had before. The $360,000 had never been the whole point. The money was the tool. The real fight was over position. Over who would count as reliable once my father weakened. Over who would be believed around Tessa. Over who would hold the moral center of the family story, and who would be recast as the danger around it. By 8:10, Karine sent an updated internal memo. She had added a section describing the pattern in the cleanest possible terms. Grant inserted into financial activity while I remained the caregiver. Grant elevated as primary contact while I continued handling logistics. Recipient routes established while I maintained records and support. Child. Positioning language appearing before open legal escalation. School and church pressure following the public filing. Settlement pressure tied to surrender of any remaining claim on my father's assets. I read that page once and closed the laptop. That was the truth of it. The betrayal had not been born in grief or confusion. It had been assembled quietly while trust was still being spent. While I was still making meals, keeping schedules, organizing records, and believing usefulness still meant belonging. Once I saw that clearly, something in me changed for good. I stopped wanting explanations. Explanations belong to accidents. This was sequence. This was planning. This was them building a future that depended on my silence while I was still holding the present together for them. By Monday, they stopped treating the lawsuit like a legal dispute and started using it like pressure. Once Karine filed to compel production and the court set an accelerated conference, my mother and Grant began pushing from every direction at once. That told me the records were starting to scare them. The first move came through the church. Pastor Neil emailed that morning asking me to step back from the widow support fundraiser until painful family matters were resolved. The wording was gentle, but the purpose was clear. My mother no longer needed everyone to understand the case. She only needed enough people to think distance from me was the safe choice. I forwarded it to Karine. Her reply was immediate. More collateral pressure. Before noon, Grant escalated. He filed a declaration claiming he had stepped in late after noticing my mother's confusion and my unusual control over the household. He described me as intense, overbearing, and too involved in my parents' lives after my divorce. It was a smarter attack than the memorial ambush because it shifted the story. Not thief. Unstable daughter. Controlling daughter. The woman who had done too much for too long and could now be recast as dangerous because she had been competent. The key word in his declaration was late. Late did not fit the service logs, the copied bank notices, the recipient updates, the event emails naming him primary contact, or Red Cedar's formation date. He needed distance now because the documents were taking it away. Corrine called after reading it. They're broadening the theory, she said. The money story is weakening. So now they're testing a control narrative. She was right. They were trying to turn invisible labor into evidence of domination. Just after 1 o'clock, the school made its move. Harold Pike emailed again, this time copying senior staff, and suspended my appointment to the Parent Advisory Council, pending clarification of elder financial exploitation and family instability. I printed the message and placed it beside my mother's voicemail, the one where she had warned me she was trying not to let any of this affect Tessa's school. Threat first, then result. Tessa walked into the kitchen while the page was still in the printer tray. What happened? The school suspended the appointment. She looked at me, then at the paper. Because Grandma talked. Yes. Her face tightened. So, this isn't just about money. No. It was about making every room around me less stable. By mid-afternoon, the family pressure started moving faster. My Aunt Marianne called crying and asked whether I had really been keeping my mother from understanding her money, and whether Tessa might be safer staying somewhere else until things calmed down. I did not answer the rumor. I asked who had told her. Grant, she said. That mattered more than the accusation itself. My mother was shaping the story, and Grant was carrying it outward. At 4:40, I found Tessa sitting on the laundry room floor, back against the dryer, knees pulled up, staring at nothing. What happened? I asked. She shrugged, then finally said, Mila asked if Grandma was going to get custody. That word hit harder than the lawsuit. Not because it made legal sense. It did not. But because once that rumor reaches a child through another child, the damage is already real. The campaign has crossed into school hallways, lunch tables, and ordinary teenage life. No one is getting custody of you, I said. She nodded too quickly. What they're doing is trying to make people nervous, I told her. Nervous people repeat things. That doesn't make them true. She looked down at the floor. I hate that they get to do that. So do we. At 5:30, my ex-husband texted. He had heard concerning things through church and wanted to know whether there was any instability at home that might affect Tessa's schedule. I sent the message to Corrine, and she told me to reply once, factually, and without emotion. So I did. There is no change to Tessa's care or schedule. All legal matters are being handled by counsel. He answered with one word. Understood. By evening, Corrine had assembled the day into a single pattern. Church pressure, school pressure, family rumor, child positioning, and spillover to my ex-husband. The case still wore the caption of a money dispute, but that was no longer the real shape of it. They were trying to make defending myself too exhausting to sustain. Not break me in one move. Reduce me everywhere. That night, Tessa did homework at the kitchen table while I reviewed Corrine's response to Grant's declaration. The dishwasher ran. Someone down the block was mowing. She asked whether we were out of printer paper. The normality of that question almost hurt. Pressure always tries to damage routine first. It wants the house to feel unstable, the child to feel uncertain, the mother to sound tired, the day to lose its shape. Sometimes the strongest answer is not dramatic. Sometimes it is keeping one evening intact. Later, Corrine called and said they had overreached. Because once people spread pressure beyond the pleadings, they create witnesses they cannot fully control. A court may tolerate a bitter family fight. It does not like seeing school, church, and a child's environment used as leverage while the facts are still disputed. After I hung up, I read through the day in order and understood the strategy more clearly than ever. The lawsuit was never the whole weapon. It was just the visible part. The real attack was the atmosphere they were trying to build around it. By Wednesday morning, the story my mother had built was still moving through the family, the church, and the school. But it had started breaking in the one place that mattered most. The record. The emergency conference was held in a narrow courtroom on the 4th floor, the kind with bad air, pale wood, and too little space between counsel tables. My mother arrived in cream and gray, subdued enough to look fragile, formal enough to look respectable. Grant walked half a step behind her, carrying a binder he had probably never opened until the night before. Their attorney looked prepared. Corin looked calm. That difference mattered. Because my mother still thought this was a room that could be controlled the way the memorial room had been controlled, through tone, posture, and the emotional advantage of speaking first. But court is less generous to performance once the documents stop matching it. Their attorney began exactly where I expected him to. He spoke of an elderly widow, grief, irregular transfers, family concern, and my increasingly dominant role in household decisions after my father's decline. He referenced confusion, dependency, and the need for immediate protection of remaining assets. He did not say thief as often as he had at the memorial. He barely said money at all. By then they had shifted almost completely into narrative protection, veto, confusion, control, family concern. The same lie, just better dressed. Then Corrine stood. She did not answer their emotion with more emotion. She did not waste time arguing about how humiliating the memorial had been or how ugly the rumors had become. She began with 3 words: source, authority, destination. The judge looked up. Corrine repeated them. Then she walked the court through the records in the cleanest order possible. The disputed transfers did not originate from trust administration. They did not originate from any login or authority associated with me. The family holding structure required dual authorization for major outside disbursements, and the administrative records confirmed that trust operations had not processed the recipient additions at issue. Instead, the available bank records showed activity through my mother's personal household profile and outside recipient routes established during the exact period now being framed as my misconduct. She handed up the first set of exhibits. Trust Amendment. Administrative Confirmation. Profile Change Metadata. Service Logs. Grant's face changed first. Not dramatically, just enough. Then Corrine moved to timing. She introduced the bank notification copied to Grant. The service note placing an adult male on speaker during verification attempts. The email where my mother said Grant was there but never understood the bank screens. And the venue correspondence naming him primary family contact months before he later claimed he stepped in late. That word was waiting for him. Late. Corrine read the sentence from his declaration aloud, then placed it beside the documents showing his involvement months earlier. The judge did not speak immediately. He only turned one page, then another. That silence felt different from the memorial silence. This one was not social discomfort. It was recalculation. Their attorney tried to recover by arguing that whatever the technical route, the deeper concern remained my over-involvement in my parents' affairs and my mother's increasing sense that she could not question me freely. It was a smart pivot if the room had still been emotional, but Corrine was already ahead of it. She introduced my mother's voicemail threatening school and church consequences. Then Grant's email offering quiet settlement if I stepped away from my claim on my father's remaining assets. Then the school suspension message, the church email, and the timeline showing the pressure campaign widening as soon as the financial structure began to unravel. Our position, Corrine said evenly, is that this is not a protective filing reacting to discovered abuse. It is a pressure structure built around a disputed transfer narrative that omits key setup records, blurs account categories, and extends beyond the pleadings into reputational and child environment coercion. The judge leaned back in his chair. Then, for the first time that morning, he addressed Grant directly. "Mr. Hollis," he said, "your declaration states you became involved late. Can you explain why your email appears on a recipient? Update confirmation months earlier?" Grant looked at his lawyer first. That was his mistake, because judges notice where people look before they answer. "I was copied on a lot of things," he said. Corrine did not move. The judge looked down again. "And the service log, noting an adult male answering verification questions on speakerphone. Was that you?" Grant swallowed. "I may have been present. May have been. Another bad choice. Present was already enough. Present destroyed late. Present made his declaration read less like concern and more like editing. My mother tried to step in then. 'Your Honor, my son was only helping me.' The judge raised one hand without looking at her. "I did not ask you, Mrs. Mercer." The room changed at that exact moment. Not because we had won. Not yet. But because my mother stopped being the center of her own story. She had controlled the memorial. She had controlled the family calls. The church messaging. The school whispers. Here, for the first time, the structure answered before she could. Corrine did not press emotionally. She did something worse. She introduced the note folder list. Call banker reroute. Move papers from study. Tessa room if needed. Church before school. Their attorney objected immediately. But even the objection helped because it forced the words into the room. The judge admitted it provisionally, subject to later foundation. And the damage was already done. Not because the list proved every financial allegation, but because it matched the sequence too cleanly. Banking. Documents. Child. Reputation. Planning had entered the record. My mother's face lost color then, though she tried to recover it by pressing her lips together and folding her hands more tightly in her lap. She still looked elegant. She no longer looked injured. Corrine asked for targeted relief. Not a speech. Immediate preservation enforcement. Narrowed treatment of the complaint's transfer theory. Pending full production. A warning against third-party pressure through school, church, and family channels. Expedited disclosure of all recipient setup records, authorization logs, and communications involving Grant, my mother, and Red Cedar. Then the judge spoke. He did not rule from outrage. He ruled from discomfort with the file in front of him. He said the record, at minimum, showed material ambiguity between trust-controlled structures and personal account activity. He said the existing submissions raised serious questions about timing, omission, and the breadth of pressure exerted outside the litigation. He said no one would be using disputed allegations to justify broader reputational leverage while the facts remained unsettled. He ordered expedited production. He warned both sides. But his eyes stayed on their table, and he made it clear that any continued contact with outside institutions touching my daughter could be viewed very unfavorably. Very unfavorably. It was not theatrical language. It did not need to be. Because when we stepped into the hallway afterward, the first thing I saw was not my mother. It was Pastor Neil, standing near the elevator bank with his coat over one arm, looking stunned. Beside him was Harold Pike from the school. I had not even known they were there. Someone on my mother's side must have expected the hearing to confirm the narrative cleanly enough that outside allies could continue acting on it without risk. Instead, both men had just heard a judge question the foundation of that narrative in open court. Harold saw me looking and came over first. His face was tight with the kind of embarrassment institutions wear badly. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I think the school may have acted too quickly." May have. I looked at him for a second, then said, "Yes." Nothing more. Pastor Neil followed, quieter than I had ever seen him. "I'm sorry for the timing of my message." I nodded once. Behind them, I could see my mother standing rigid near the courtroom door while her lawyer spoke to her in a low, controlled voice. Grant was no longer holding the binder. It was tucked under his arm loosely now, as though even he understood it had stopped functioning as a shield. Then something small but final happened. Aunt Marianne, who had apparently come with my mother, crossed the hall toward me instead of toward them. She did not cry this time. She did not whisper. She simply said, "I should have asked you first." That was the social break. Not applause, not confrontation, just movement. One person choosing the other direction in public. Tessa was waiting at home when I got back, still in her school sweatshirt. Homework spread across the kitchen table. She looked up the moment I walked in. "How was it?" I set my bag down and took off my coat. "Better than they expected." She studied my face for a second, searching for the hidden version underneath the sentence. Then she nodded. "Did Grandma lie in court?" She tried to let the papers do it for her. Tessa absorbed that, then looked down at her geometry sheet. "Did it work?" "No." That was enough for her. She slid a second mug toward my side of the table. Tea. Already made. The house felt different that evening. Not relieved, exactly. Relief is too simple for something that has already touched your child, your name, your routines, and the rooms you used to enter without caution. But something had shifted. At church, they had stepped back from me. At school, they had suspended me. In the family, they had repeated what they were given. In court, for the first time, The movement reversed. The judge had not called me innocent in some cinematic speech. He had done something better. He had forced the story to answer to sequence, category, and timing. And once that happened, the people who had stood closest to my mother's version began taking one step away from it. That was how collapse started. Not loudly, structurally. That night, after Tessa went upstairs, Karine called one last time. They won't recover from today easily, she said. Because of the ruling? Because of the questions? And because they answered them badly. She was right. A bad answer in private can be repaired. A bad answer in front of witnesses becomes memory. I looked down at the hearing binder still sitting on my kitchen table. The tabs neat. The exhibits squared. The timelines clipped cleanly in place. The whole thing looked almost boring now, which was its own kind of power. My mother had tried to make me collapse publicly in front of my father's photograph. Instead, she and Grant had started losing the room in front of a judge, a pastor, a school official, and one family member who finally walked the right way down the hall. They had spent days trying to make me look unstable. But by the end of Wednesday, they were the ones beginning to look unsteady whenever the paperwork came out. By the end of the week, no one was asking me to explain myself anymore. That was how I knew the fight had changed. Not because my mother apologized. She did not. Not because Grant admitted anything. He did not. It changed because the structure had finally become stronger than the performance, and once that happens, people stop leaning toward the loudest version of the story and start stepping quietly away from it. On Friday morning, the school sent a formal email reinstating my appointment to the Parent Advisory Council pending final resolution of the case. The wording was careful and institutional, thinner than the damage it was trying to repair. But it came with the right names copied. I read it once, printed it, and set it on the counter beside Tessa's lunch container. She came downstairs, still buttoning her cuff, saw the page, and scanned just enough to understand. So they're walking it back. Yes. Are you answering? Later. She nodded, took the strawberries I had packed for her, and said, Good. That was all. It was enough. By noon, Karine had the next production set. Fuller records. Cleaner metadata. Enough to make their position worse, not better. The disputed transfers had moved exactly the way the earlier materials suggested, out of my mother's personal banking structure, through outside recipient routes created in advance, into an account linked to Grant and into Red Cedar. More damaging than the transfers themselves were the later communications. They showed my mother's side discussing how to contain spread and avoid further school complications after the public filing, which meant the outside pressure had not been accidental fallout. It had been managed. Karine called once she finished reviewing it. We're in the settlement phase now, she said. Because they want peace? Because they finally understand downside. That was the better answer. The first proposal came that afternoon. Confidential standstill. Mutual non-disparagement. Suspension of outside communications. A family-directed accounting process to avoid further public damage. There was no apology in it, no acknowledgement of the memorial, the school, the church, or Tessa. Just a cleaner version of what my mother had wanted from the start. Enough truth to frighten her, not enough truth to finish remaking the story around her. Karine forwarded it with one question. Do you want peace, or do you want terms? I knew immediately. Terms. Not because I wanted revenge. By then, revenge felt smaller than the damage they had tried to build. I wanted the school pressure stopped in writing. I wanted no more direct or indirect contact with Tessa, designed to suggest alternate refuge, instability at home, or some calmer life elsewhere. I wanted the accounting to continue. I wanted the record preserved. And I wanted anything said outside the case about my supposed misconduct to stop. Karine drafted the response that evening. It was exact and unsentimental. That night, Tessa asked if we could eat on the back steps because she was tired of looking at paper. So I carried out 2 bowls of pasta, 2 forks, and the same folded dish towel I still used as a hot pad because I had never replaced it. We sat in the cooling air while the neighbor's sprinkler clicked in the distance. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. After a while, Tessa asked, Are we still going to Grandma's for Easter? I don't know yet, I said. She nodded and kept eating. Then she said, I'm not really mad about the money. I'm mad that she was planning things around me before I even knew there was a problem. There it was again, the clearest truth of the whole week. She was, I said. Tessa set her fork down. Then I think she should be the one who waits now. I looked at her across the dimming yard and saw that something in her had settled too. Yes, I said. I think so too. By Monday, most of the settlement terms were done. My mother accepted more than I expected and less than she should have. That was fine. I was no longer measuring the outcome by remorse. I was measuring it by containment. Written withdrawal of outside pressure. No further contact with school or church regarding allegations about me. No more messaging to Tessa designed to suggest she should sleep elsewhere or see my house as unstable. Full cooperation with the accounting review. Preservation of records. Silence going forward, but only after the damage stopped spreading. Grant signed too. That surprised me for about 1 second. Then it did not. He had built his confidence inside rooms where tone mattered more than sequence. Once sequence took over, he had nowhere comfortable left to stand. The final administrative meeting took place 2 weeks later in a conference room with Daniel Sayer on video and 2 binders of reconciled records on the table. My mother attended with counsel. Grant arrived late and spoke little. Corinne did most of the talking for me. She did not gloat. She did not reopen things that no longer needed reopening. She simply made sure the account distinctions, routing sequence, and communication boundaries were stated cleanly into the final summary. My mother looked older that day. Not fragile, just reduced somehow, as if performance had taken up more room in her than truth ever had. And losing the performance had left visible space behind. At one point she turned toward me as if she might say something personal. Maybe my name. Maybe an explanation. Maybe one of those phrases mothers use when they hope history will rescue them from consequence. I did not help her. I signed where Corinne indicated, slid the pen back across the table, and let the paper speak. That was all. No speech. No final argument. No need. When I got home, the house was quiet. Tessa was still at practice. The kitchen looked exactly as I had left it that morning, except for the light changing across the counter. I set down my bag, took off my shoes, and stood for a moment, with my hand resting on the back of a chair. There were no more documents to print. No more rumors I needed to outrun. No more rooms where I had to arrive early just to be believed before someone else spoke first. So I made tea. Not because I was shaken, because I wanted it. When Tessa came home half an hour later, flushed from practice and carrying her cleats by the laces, she stopped in the doorway and looked at me. Done? Yes. She set the cleats down, crossed the kitchen, and hugged me quickly, like she had finally decided the answer could be trusted. Then she pulled back and asked, "Are we okay?" I looked around the kitchen. Her water bottle by the sink, the folded mail, the clean dish towel, the school forms clipped by the fridge, the ordinary shape of a life that does not look dramatic until someone tries to take its center away. Yes, I said. We are. That was the ending. My mother had tried to move money, language, and institutions in a way that would turn me from foundation into threat. She had tried to make my care look like control and my steadiness look like danger. She had tried to build a future in which my daughter would learn to look elsewhere for safety. But when the noise fell away, the structure answered differently. My daughter still came home to me, and that was the only verdict that finally mattered.